Hi everyone, I'm Jayden from the Corangamite Catchment Management Authority, and I'm here to talk about the estuary management, local challenges and opportunities in southwest Victoria from a management perspective. So the region I'm talking about is in Victoria, Australia, and this highlighted area to the west of Melbourne. The dark blue dots represent the estuaries that are opened in this region, and the lighter blue dots are some of the estuaries that are not. These estuaries are all icol estuaries. There's only one in our region that isn't an icol estuary. So we have 11 estuaries that are artificially open, and there's up to 23 openings per year in this region. So really quickly, because Greg Woodward has already covered this, policy and the role of the CCMA, we authorise requests from permit holders to artificially open estuaries under the Water Act. We use the Estuary Entrance Management Support System to assess the risks of opening the estuary at a given point in time. That's informed by water quality monitoring that's undertaken, and policy in this region has a strong focus on the beneficiary pays approach. So implementing policy is always a little bit more challenging. So even though risk-based assessments do inform estuary opening, human assets and impacts to those, so things like houses and roads, are what really drive decisions to open estuaries. The beneficiary pays approach is actually quite flexible. It's not in place at all of the estuaries, and agreement with beneficiaries in places where it's currently not happening is really hard to get because it's an increased cost of resources and time on the organisation. So this can make removing the drivers of estuary opening harder to achieve. So if you don't have the beneficiary involved, there's no real incentive to remove some of those assets that drive estuary opening. So why they opened? Well, it basically comes from a different time. So this photo shows floodplain inundation at one of our systems, and you can see it impacts on things like roads, grazing land, recreational areas, and can also isolate communities. So it's basically from a different time when the environment wasn't really considered, and grazing, urban assets, roads, all these things are impacted. In our region, there's no environmental reason to open estuaries. So some of the risks of estuary openings that we see are fish deaths in the short term, fish strandings, they get disconnected from the main channel, and the fish deaths are driven by dissolved oxygen levels decreasing from the anoxic water coming off the floodplains. And in the longer term, we see changes in ecological condition from repeated openings and loss of environmental values. Just important to acknowledge here that natural openings still have risks, but they're lower because of the links to flow and climatic conditions that occur at the time. Also, in this region, there's federal government listing around these types of estuaries and the communities that depend on them, so that puts an extra layer of importance on managing them correctly. Some of the physical constraints can be really interesting. So even when you dig a channel to open an estuary, they don't always open. It depends on what the swell's doing and how much energy is coming down the river system. So this photo is a good one. It shows an open estuary in this case, but there's still assets that are flooded and impacted by high water levels. So many assets in a lot of these systems are actually built really close to the water level required for a successful estuary opening. So what that means is if there's a lot of rain, there can be a really small window to act before estuaries or before flooding occurs. Some of the communication challenges are also quite interesting because it's such a complex issue. So environmental drivers continues to be questioned. Some people see water quality implications or fish population declines, and they want estuaries open to fix that. And a lot of the science really shows the opposite occurs when that happens. And, still the environment doesn't really have a strong voice amongst the competing pressures to open these systems. So there's a need for more education, like the Estuary Watch program in the Corangamite region, which involves community volunteers in monitoring and educating them through that process. In this region, we've had two recent pieces of work that have really helped us in this space. They involve multiple experts to look at specific systems, and that work really highlighted that artificial estuary openings shouldn't be undertaken for environmental reasons. So that was a really good, clear outcome. That artificial openings come with environmental costs, particularly where floodplains cannot be inundated, and it causes ecological change over time, which we need to manage. But I want to acknowledge here there is some species-specific work that highlights the need for artificial estuary openings. So a certain plant species might only need to be inundated for a certain period of time, and then after that, the recommendations can be that an estuary needs to be open to protect that species. Climate change is another really interesting one. So how do we prepare? Split this up into two elements. So there's going to be increased flooding of assets, is what most of the work tells us. So we need to start working towards change now. And by strengthening the link between the beneficiaries of artificial estuary opening, what you can do is start managing out the reasons to open these estuaries over time, which also helps with climate change. And then when it comes to ecological change, there's some important questions around, do we intervene or let the systems adapt? Do we treat all systems the same, or ones that are more heavily impacted by water extraction, do we treat them differently? And all of these things have implications to amenity as well. This is a really important slide because change is hard. This photo represents an estuary running through the middle here, and either side of that is floodplain. And in this case, it's inundated. So when floodplains are inundated, this is really highly valuable land to local landholders, particularly for grazing over summer. So if we're going to change things, there's implications to landholders, houses, roads, and other human assets. And these things have been in place for over a generation, so you can't just go changing things on a whim. So how do we balance those competing objectives, and how much are we prepared to invest to move to a new future? So what our local approach is an ecosystem approach. So we try to bring in all the information on the system to get holistic recommendations that include the whole system, mainly because species-specific information is really hard to use from a management perspective. In doing this work, we bring in all the variables to get clear and defendable recommendations on things like high-risk period, recommended management approaches. And in this work, we're also clear that there will be winners and losers of any decisions, and that's environmental winners and losers, but also between other stakeholders. And we also try to connect community experts, traditional owners, and government stakeholders in doing this work, because that's the way you take people on this really important journey. This is basically an adaptation of the Victorian flows method, which we use to deliver water down rivers in this part of the world. So once we have a clearer understanding of the environmental recommendations, we can consider those more fully against traditional owner, social and economic needs. And this helps inform local management decisions, future land management and asset decisions, even though risk-based assessments do, and it also informs future policy and strategies. And that is all. Thank you very much for your time.